So I'm going to introduce you first,
Okay.
and then kind of bet that you can be spontaneous.
Okay.
You can look at the camera or look at me at the same time, not to
Okay.
worry. Hi, I'm Robin Stienberg. Welcome to the National Queen's Choice Online News, Same with Hyatt International Hotels. Here I have a guest, Miss Kelsey Lundgre?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. She's a human rights activist and advocate, educator, researcher, and she has worked with refugees and asylum seekers in the Middle East for over 7 years, and not just that, in North Africa and Turkey. And we're going to ask her some questions about updates on what it means to be a refugee in the Middle East, and as well as other updates and happenings. Hi, Ms. Kelsey, and welcome to the National Queen's Choice Online News.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Could you tell us, what does it mean to be a refugee? Because a lot of people are confused between a refugee in the Middle East and a refugee in Asia, and also the term the Arab Spring, what it is.
Sure. So to begin with the term refugee, it's a term that's thrown around a lot, like you said, and people aren't really sure what the actual definition of a refugee is. So there is a legal definition that's actually universal. So anybody from any region, if they meet this definition and they can become a refugee, they will be given refugee status. And the definition of a refugee comes from international law, comes from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They have bodies of law that talk about who a refugee is. And the most important points to know about refugees are, one, they've fled their countries of origin. So they've had to leave their countries. They've basically given up on the government, on their country. They've decided that they can no longer be protected by their own government or by their own country. And so once they've crossed an international border into a new country, they have to show that they were being persecuted in the country that they fled for a specific reason. And those reasons are either persecution based on their nationality, on their race, on their religious orientation, on their political affiliation. And then there's something in the law called particular social group. And that plays out in many different ways. So we see refugees who are considered refugees based on persecution for a particular social group. And they have fled for a variety of reasons. Some of them because maybe they're gay and it's not accepted in their country, so they've had to leave because they were going to be killed. We've seen women who were at risk of being sex trafficked or who have been beaten and discriminated against and tortured simply because they're women. So that is the legal definition of a refugee. And then in terms of talking about the Arab Spring, people are there's sort of contention over what the actual meaning of the Arab Spring is. But most people have come to understand it as a movement or a wave of revolutions and uprisings that have taken over the Middle East and Africa. And the catalyst for this movement really was in Tunisia with the self-immolation of a vegetable seller, Mohammed, I might mess up his last name, Wazizi. And so that's what the Arab Spring is, and that's what a refugee is.
Speaking of which, what's happening in the Middle East right now? Could you give us an overview? What's happening in Libya, right across Egypt, and North Africa? Because there's a lot of confusion and conflicting reports, of where the movement is going to and what's happening to refugees.
Yeah. So I think that that's a really great question, and I've had the privilege of working in a few of the countries that are now part of the larger Arab Spring movement. I haven't had the privilege of working in Libya, so a lot of my presentation that I gave earlier when I was speaking about refugees in Libya were coming from secondary sources. But I have worked in Syria, I've also worked in Jordan, and I've worked in Egypt, which are all part of the larger Arab Spring movement. And I would say, if your question is more geared towards what's happening in refugees in these countries, I would say that there's a lot of issues that are coming up for refugees because of that political unrest due to the Arab Spring movement. So in Syria, for example, where there's a large Iraqi refugee population, my organization and other refugee advocacy organizations have seen their clients being targeted and discriminated against, and there's a sort of a wave of xenophobia that's taking over the country. where previously, before the Arab Spring, Iraqis and Syrians were brothers. The Syrian government opened its borders to the Iraqi refugees. It allowed them to come in, and it provided safety for them. But now, after the Arab Spring, Syria has sort of turned on Iraqi refugees. The president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, went on state television and announced that Iraqi refugees were actually, he didn't say refugees, but he said Iraqis in the country were responsible for the uprising. They had smuggled weapons in from Iraq. And because of this, we saw some of our refugee clients being targeted by state security, being forcibly deported, being put in a position where they felt like they had no other option but to return to Iraq, where their lives would be certainly in danger, which is why they fled in the first place. In Egypt, we see a lot of discrimination against African refugees, which the majority of refugees in Egypt are African. We also see a rise in xenophobia there. Tension between African and Arabs in Egypt has always existed, but after the Arab Spring in particular, we saw kind of like a security vacuum open up, and people were trying to fill it. The protesters were trying to fill it, the military was trying to fill it, the police may have been trying to fill it, the government was trying to fill it, and because of all this chaos, refugees were sort of caught in the middle, and there wasn't a lot of protection for them. They were being harassed, some of them beaten, some of them tortured by Egyptian authorities, some of them even claimed to have been handed over to Sudanese state security, so there's a lot of Sudanese refugees there. And we also saw something interesting in that the refugee communities in Egypt became really angry with UNHCR, and that's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And they're the intergovernmental organization who is supposed to be protecting the refugees. The refugees felt in Egypt they were not being protected by them after the Arab Spring. And so they staged their own protests, in some way emulating the protests that were happening in Egypt, with the Egyptian nationals against the government, against, in particular, the former president Hosni Mubarak. So I found that really an interesting aspect of refugees living under the Arab Spring, that they decided to protest against who they saw as their oppressor. And they even emulated things like self-immolation, which is something that I talked about in my presentation here at the conference. A Sudanese refugee woman who was pregnant at the time decided that she didn't want to live anymore. She felt like nobody was looking out for her, and so she lit herself on fire. And I found that a really interesting aspect of an Egyptian case study.
And speaking of which, about the updates and reviews, is there any equality for women and children? You know, I mean, the refugees who are living in such dire conditions. What's happening about the situation between the women and children? Are they being treated equally?
Yeah. So a lot of the times, women and children, the way that it normally works is that UNHCR, because they rely on funding, and they're really the main source of financial, health, educational support for refugees that are living in the Middle East, and refugees that are living all over the world, quite honestly. But it really depends on funding. So obviously they don't have enough money every year to support every refugee. They can only give a little bit to some people. And normally what they do is that they go into the refugee communities and they identify the most vulnerable populations. And a lot of the time that is women who are alone. Maybe they've been widowed because their husbands have died during a conflict that they were escaping from, or something of that nature. If they have children, especially babies, children under like 2 years old or 4 years old, they do receive extra assistance, and they're seen as a priority category for both resettlement and assistance, because they obviously are alone. They have nobody to, because most refugees can't work in the region, they have nobody to provide them support. They can't work themselves. They have young children. So women and children are usually targeted for assistance, are seen as the most vulnerable, and are given assistance above other refugee populations. And there also are other targeted forms of assistance for refugees and children, like children. Most of them, at least in the Middle East, are able to attend public school along with the nationals of the countries that they're in. Women are often provided a lot of social and psychosocial support, especially if they've been the victim of atrocities like rape, which we have seen a lot with women who are refugees. So there is targeted assistance and targeted support just for women and children. And for the most part, UNHCR is trying to do a good job of making sure that they receive that support above other groups because they're more vulnerable.
Now, pertaining to refugees and the future of the Arab Springs, they call it, what is the view of the Israelis? Has Israel given any assistance to refugees?
Yeah, this is a very sensitive topic because Israel has its own refugee issues that it's grappling with, and their borders are very secure. They're very tight. So in terms of refugees that may be fleeing because of the Arab Spring in these countries, they're not going to go to Israel because Israel has a history of doing what's called hot deportations. So that's a phrase that's used in international refugee law and in my field. And what that means is that technically under international law, if a refugee goes to the border of a country, claims that I'm here to seek asylum, I think I'm a refugee, I want to be given an interview, I want somebody to determine under international law whether I am. Obviously, a refugee's not going to state it like that, but that's basically what they're seeking. They're seeking asylum and they want to be recognized as a refugee. People at the border, especially a country like Israel that's a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which means they're a signatory to the law, they've agreed to follow the law. They're supposed to do a brief refugee status determination at the border. They're supposed to ask the person, are you fearful of going back to your country? What persecution have you faced there? Israel has been known to not do this, to just not even bother. They don't ask, do you think you're a refugee? They don't ask if they're fearful of going back to their country. They don't ask what persecution they may have faced. They just send them back without asking them anything.
Really?
Yeah, and that's been a big issue in international law. And I have to admit my expertise isn't on Israel, but I know that refugees are not trying to flee there unless they're incredibly desperate. And there are groups of refugees that are pretty desperate that have crossed the desert, the Sinai, trying to get to Israel. Many of them die on the trek there. Many of them, if they make it inside of Israel, are denied asylum. They're denied asylum. They're denied refugee status. So Israel is grappling with its own issues and doesn't have the best record of really supporting refugees or following international law. So I think, in the most part, people try and avoid going there if they can because there's been a lot of problems.
I understand. So now, in terms of many individuals seeking asylums and seeking the asylum status, is it easy for them to do so right now, today?
Well, it's hard to say whether it's easy. So that question takes a little bit of thought. Basically, it's easy for them to request refugee status, but it might not be easy for them to gain that status for a variety of reasons. So most of the countries right now that don't have domestic asylum procedures, UNHCR is in place. And every asylum seeker that I've met knew right away, once they cross the border, if they believe that they're a refugee, they're supposed to go directly to UNHCR. UNHCR is the one, especially in the Middle East region where domestic asylum procedures don't exist, are the ones that determine who's a refugee and not. So the steps are, a refugee will go to UNHCR. They'll say, I believe I'm a refugee. UNHCR, an official from UNHCR, will conduct what's known as a refugee status determination interview with the person. They'll follow the law, and they'll decide, based on what the person says about their fear of persecution, whether they're outside their country and things of that nature, they'll follow the law and decide whether that person is a refugee or not. So it's easy in a sense for a refugee to access UNHCR and to access that avenue, but it can be very difficult for a refugee who has been traumatized, who has lost everything in some instances, who has gone through horrendous acts that are really, really hard to believe, to articulate clearly and in legal terms what their persecution claim is, what their refugee claim is, why they left their country, why they're fearful to go back. So we've seen a lot of times that without proper advocates like my organization, if they don't have people supporting them and helping them through these interviews, they're unfairly denied refugee status. So there can be a lot of issues.
How can countries can come to understand and able to help these refugees in the Middle East right now today? Is there any way that they can send a donation to, or is there any voluntary service that they can tend to?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of great NGOs that are providing assistance to refugees in a variety of capacities. So I would really encourage people, if they want to support refugees that are more local in their region, if possible, to try and do some research, either online or maybe contacting UNHCR in their area, in their country, if that's feasible for them, and find out, educate themselves about the refugee populations that might exist in their region. If they're particularly interested in the Middle East, I know a lot of great organizations, and it depends on what kind of assistance they want their money to go towards. So there's a variety of ways different organizations are helping refugees. Some are providing, basic services, health services, psychological support. My organization, for example, which is the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project, we provide legal assistance. So we really, and all pro bono, all for free, and our organization runs based on grants and donations that we receive, both from foundations but also from individuals. And so if people are interested in supporting an organization like ours that provides legal assistance, they can go to our website, which is refugeerights.com, where they can look us up on the web, Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project, IRAP.
Having experience and doing a lot of research in the Middle East among the refugees, is there any cultural awareness, which my viewers need to know and they need to observe, because it's predominantly Islamic, I think. So is there a dress code and a kind of ethics that they need to be aware of that you personally have learned?
In terms of maybe the way I've had to adapt working with Muslim communities and things like that, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's right. Among the refugees, especially.
Among refugees,
yeah, that's right. Is it right to give them money outrightly, or?
I would encourage people not to just hand money to refugees, only because when people are in desperate situations, a lot of the times they don't always make the proper or correct decisions. So I think that it's much better to give it to an organization who will then give the refugee supplies and things that they actually need. And I'm not trying to say at all that I don't think refugees are capable of making their own decisions. It's quite the opposite. I think that they're a very intelligent population on the whole. They know what they want. They know what their rights should be. They know how they should be treated. And they're advocating just as hard for themselves as other people like my organization are along with them. So I don't want to give that impression at all, but I do want to say that I also think that it's more of like an exploitive thing and a power position thing, where I wouldn't feel right and I wouldn't encourage people just to hand money to refugees. I think it's better to go through NGOs who have the experience, who have the relationship with the community, and can make sure that they are getting the services that they need. In terms of how I've had to adapt culturally to working in the Middle East and working with populations that might be quite different from me in terms of background and religion and ethnicity and beliefs, I've learned to adapt quite well, and I think that refugees are some of the most generous and wonderful people that I've ever worked with. And it's true that having worked in the Middle East, the majority of the people that I work with are Muslim, and I've taken it upon myself both through formal education and also just living in the culture to become really aware of how to change my behavior. I mean, I definitely try to be, more respectful, dress more modestly. I'm from the United States and from a very liberal city where I'm used to wearing whatever I want, acting however I want. But I think that I've changed more of my behavior, not so much because I'm working with a different culture, but I think because I'm working in a professional capacity and I have to present myself as a professional. But it's also a very fine line, because I want to always be aware of the fact that by working with refugees, I'm already in a position of power. Many of them look to me for guidance, and I want to try and balance that power. And I still want to assist them, same time, I want to respect them, and I want them to want to assist themselves.
And before we sign off
Yeah.
soon, what advice would you give in your life experience, having dealing, with refugees, in the Middle East,
Yeah.
and what your life lessons that you probably would be able to take back, for others to follow in your footsteps.
Yeah, I laugh because I'm still learning every day, and gaining new experiences. And I would say for people that want to work with refugees in particular, or who may want to work in the Middle East, I would just find an issue that you really care about more than anything. And for me, that's working with refugees and working on their protection, their resettlement, and really trying to advance policies that are going to affect their lives in a positive way. Because when you're working on an issue that you care about more than anything else, that's what really motivates you to keep going. And I also have to say that working with the refugee population really inspires me to keep going. And so I would just say to, again, just do some research about the region you want to work in. I think, like you said, understanding cultural norms is very important, possibly like learning their language, which will help break down some, not only communication barriers, but it helps build trust between the population that you're trying to work with. I would look into local NGOs that may be working on issues that you're interested in, and maybe see if you can volunteer with them, intern with them, write for them, do research, anything. Because to be honest, that's how a lot of my job experience has gone, is that I started out as somebody who was a volunteer or an intern, and because of my dedication, and I became invaluable to the organization, I was hired for a position. So I think there's definitely ways to kind of break into the world of working with refugees.
Well, thank you, Kelsey, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here at the National Green's Choice. I'm Robin Stienberg. Have a great day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yep.